And as you may have noted from the notification that just happened, this meeting will be recorded. I'm going to give folks one more minute before we get started. All right, now I'm going to pull up our share screen. All right, can folks give me the thumbs up if they can see my slide deck? Oh, great. Awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Second, I actually have to pull up my other screen too. Boop, boop, boop. All right, just a second. There we go. Okay, so hello and welcome to our Community Stories Best Starts workshop. I'm Erin Fenner. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a communication specialist with Best Starts for Kids. In this session, I'm going to highlight a framework we think can support your organization's communication strategies and practical ways you can get your comms strategies rolling or support existing strategies. A little background on me. I started my career in journalism. I was a reporter in Portland, Colorado, and Boise, covering all sorts of subjects, including breaking news, politics, the court system, and social movements. Then I shifted into electoral and nonprofit communications. When you go into this sort of work, like I did, you probably approach it with a sincere value of the power of stories, but I did not anticipate how powerful media truly is until I was working in it every day. Something I noticed when I covered breaking news is that every time I would cover stories about people getting in car accidents or injured in a disaster, or losing their homes to a fire, when I included their family's GoFundMe page, which I always did, their donations would skyrocket as soon as we'd press publish. And I think that kind of like hit me in a way that this is very practical, there's just like a very practical power to stories. When I shifted into communications work for community organizations, it was amazing to see how people's stories could make changes at the local and state level for themselves and for the broader community. I think we can often underestimate and overestimate the power of narrative media in our strategies. So I'd like to segue to our next slide, where I'll highlight a useful way of looking at the role of narrative/communications in our work. And I'll kind of sometimes alter between saying like storytelling, narrative, and communications. And they all kind of, functionally mean the same thing. I'll try to stick to saying storytelling though, so we can have that clarity. Okay, so this is kind of a visual that I use to sort of highlight how I see comms strategies as being a co-supporting strategy. So I've often seen folks undervalue the real power of communications and not necessarily use the strategy in the ways that is going to be most supportive to their work. And at the same time, I've seen people put all their eggs in the communications basket. And so I think it's really important that we recognize the power of communications as a co-supporting strategy. I like to think of it as part of a three-legged stool. And so you imagine it as a three-legged stool, and a lot of our work that we're doing here together is about building equitable systems. To support that work overall, we need to imagine that there's three legs that are supporting it. One is the narrative work, which is communications. It creates a story that fosters understanding, inspires support, and builds new opportunities for connection. The narrative leg, also the communications leg, is standing alongside two other legs: people power, the support of our staff and community members, and infrastructure, the policies we establish, the processes we implement, and the institutions we uphold. And so to talk a little bit more about how these different legs sort of like co-support each other, I'll just say that infrastructure can refer to physical buildings, organizations, policies and processes. It's the structures we build, both like physical and real, and also like organizational, with the support from people who are motivated through storytelling. People power, which refers to the actual human beings behind the work, they rely on infrastructure to continue their work consistently, and they are driven and motivated and able to reach other people through storytelling. People can shift viewpoints and they can deepen their support of work when they understand it through storytelling, and when told this story by a storyteller they find reliable. Narrative is where our communications lives. Our work is supported by the people who are a part of this process, who can share stories and act as messengers. The infrastructure supports our narrative work in positive storytelling through offering material realities and benefits of the work to the community. You know, something I think about is that communications is, it is as powerful as the work that we're accomplishing. If we're telling a story that doesn't have any material impact, then the story doesn't carry the same weight. So that infrastructural support, the people who are doing the work, all of these things are really essential and co-supporting. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that framework to help get us grounded in sort of like a really good way to think of like how communication strategies fit into our overall work. So now I'm going to segue into talking about community storytelling. And I think of community storytelling as a little bit different than maybe some more dominant frameworks that are a bit more top down. Community storytelling is really about leading with, partnership and working alongside community members, making sure that we are always prioritizing the storyteller over the story. And I think that framework not only really lives into our values and how we approach our work, but it also just ends up being really powerful and successful for a lot of our goals. So I'll kind of go through just some of these overarching principles. I don't think that this is I don't think this captures all of the principles, but it's a lot of the things that I keep in mind every day when I try to do community storytelling work. So when we're doing messaging around our work, when we're talking about our work, when we are pitching stories or writing about our work, it's so important to lead with the stories of people who are directly impacted by the work. And I'm going to pause on impacted real quick because I think I've seen a lot of folks lead with, policy experts or executive directors. And if you're writing about, for instance, rent assistance for families with young people, then families with young people using rent assistance are going to be the most powerful storytellers. And that's not just because their stories pull at heartstrings, but moreover, because they're experts in their experience. They're going to have they're going to be also just stronger communicators in general about that experience because of their direct experience with it. And they'll also be easier to relate to a broader audience. Next, ensure that storytellers have guidance and support, but that they have full agency in how their story is shared. I'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but it's just really essential that we make sure that, as I said earlier, we prioritize the storyteller over the story, and also that we are acting as partners. So also a good thing to think about is reach multiple unique platforms with stories relevant to the platform's audiences. So think about the audiences that you're trying to reach, think about where they get their information from, and those are the sort of platforms that then you are trying to seek. And you're not going to want to necessarily just sort of parachute in, but rather work in partnership with people who are from those communities who can carry that message. And then a point around data, which, data and research and facts are essential and critical components to telling our story. But when we are focused on our communication strategy, when it's about reaching a broader or, a specific audience, data is best used as a tool to support the story, but not to prioritize over the story. I'll give an example. I've edited, I've reviewed and supported on a lot of op-eds and other like materials and stories that were really challenging for me to read and understand and relate to, because they were stacked with an overwhelming amount of data and research findings with a lot of technical language and acronyms. Data is a really important tool, but people will better understand it as a supporting element of a story. Most folks understand data better when they have a human story attached to it. So lead with the story and use data to support the story. All right. And then I'm going to come back to how we need to prioritize the storyteller, because it is actually pretty fundamental part of how we find success in these sort of community storytelling strategies. Person first storytelling. So we got to start from a place of authentic relationships. And a good practical way to think about that is just in terms of like the folks who we're working with, who we are highlighting their stories, who we are connecting to, potentially reporters. We need to make sure that we have a authentic relationship with them. And that means that we're not just trying to have a relationship with them over the course of the story, but before and after. It's essential that we, as I've said now a couple times, prioritize the storyteller over the story, because when we do this, we ensure that we engage the storyteller as a partner. Not only are we operating more ethically when we do that, but we're also building a relationship that continues beyond the one-off story. Most of the storytellers I've worked with have partnered with me many times over. And that just that gives your work a lot more power. Offer information about the storytelling process. And this is a really good way to just, make sure that you're adhering to that sort of, principle of, prioritizing partnership. Be as informative about the storytelling process as you can. Go over the process for interviewing, editing, and approval, whether it's a story you share in a blog post, video, op-ed, or carried out by a reporter. And sometimes we don't always know everything about how the process is going to unfold. And it's totally valuable at that moment to just be clear about what we don't know as well. And, a good segue is be transparent about risks and intentions. Definitely do not understate risks. This is particularly critical for people who have experienced, domestic violence, folks who are undocumented. Sometimes people can underestimate the reach of stories. I don't underestimate who might read a story. Don't overpromise. While storytelling can have profound impact, we cannot predict the exact shape of that impact. Transparency around your intentions is also really important. Make sure you are clear about the goals that you have for telling the story. So you can see if you and the storyteller are on the same page. If you have alignment with your storyteller, that's just pretty critical to moving forward. All right. And then ask about their storytelling preferences. Be direct in asking questions about what the storyteller's boundaries are. Are they comfortable sharing their name? Are they comfortable being photographed? And any other sort of boundaries that they may have. And that will also inform this next bullet point, which is offer options and supports. So once you have their boundaries in mind, provide a menu of storytelling options based on those options so they can pick their preference. So if you have somebody who's really eager to, get their story out there, they're eager to share their name, they're eager to be photographed, you can probably provide them a list of many options saying, I could connect you to a reporter, or we could draft an op-ed together. We can do a blog post, we could do a video. If they have far more boundaries, I think it's still important to provide multiple options and to not necessarily frame it as a deficit that they have so many boundaries, but rather just say oh, okay, well, here's what your options are. We could do a social media post where we cite you as somebody who, is a member of our organization or supports us, or we could do a blog post, and just think through the options that might be most relevant for the work you're doing. Sometimes I like to quote folks in outgoing emails. So make sure that you provide folks with a series of options when you're working with them, even if they have a lot of boundaries, but they still want to share their story, because that gives them sort of a lot of agency in that process. And then leave the decisions, the big decisions, to the storyteller. The storyteller should really be making the big choices about whether they want to, publish, or like whether the final draft is ready to go. They should be the last stop before publishing or pressing send on that pitch. And this is something to like think through. If you are working on an op-ed or news story, it can be a lot trickier because the editor and publication ultimately has a lot more power in that dynamic. So that's an area where you need to be really clear about the process of working with a reporter and editors, that there can be really impressive reach, but that there's significantly less control over the final product when you get to a certain stage in that process, like which is right around when you'd start talking to a reporter. So just provide as much information as you can. Yeah. All right. I'm going to move over into an example. And so just a little bit of a little disclaimer is that I worked on this story before I worked at the county, and that the county cannot and does not engage in any advocacy work. The rules that your organization may have around advocacy storytelling is going to be different for each organization. So that would be something you need to work with on your team. But I just wanted to use this as an example of person-led and impactful storytelling. So I worked with an organization that focused on renter supports and navigating challenges for renters. And that's how I met Terkesa Burrows, who was dealing with a striking situation that represented a systemic issue many renters in King County have had to navigate. So this particular situation was around renters who were in dire need of repairs, but not getting them, even though they make requests through all the appropriate channels. At the time I was working on this, this was something that we were seeing happen across the region. And so Terkesa and her sweet little baby, Faith, was using Section 8 vouchers for her apartment in Capitol Hill. And she went through all the appropriate channels to report a rodent infestation in her apartment. But even though she reported this problem to her apartment owners and to the city, and even though the city was then issuing a fine on the property owner, it didn't result in the property owner or the city resolving the infestation or offering the impacted renters relocation assistance. So we worked with Terkesa to understand what options she wanted to pursue. She was very adamant that she wanted to share her story. She wanted to be photographed. She wanted to use her name because she wanted to do this for herself. She wanted to do this for her daughter, and she wanted to do this for her neighbors. She wanted to make sure that nobody else would have to feel like they needed to be quiet about this. So I talked through the different options we had. I talked through a reporter that I wanted to work with on this. I explained to her, my relationship with the reporter, that I trusted that he would do a good job both investigating the case and also that he would be very respectful and considerate of her story. And I think that piece is really important. I hear questions around what are the best news organizations to work with? And I think it's important to think more in terms of who are the best reporters to work with and base that on the relationships that you have with reporters. It's important that while we're building relationships in community and with storytellers, we're also making connections with reporters so we can work from a place of deep understanding of their motivations and trust. So one of the things that I did in this process to make sure that Terkesa felt supported was I joined Terkesa for the interview, and I also invited her friend who had been helping her through this challenging time to join her as well. So she was surrounded by folks who had supports and also additional information. Now, I wanted to highlight this as an impactful story because the very day the story went live, the property owner paid for her to stay in a hotel and began the process of offering her and her neighbors relocation support. And they were taking immediate steps to rectify the infestation. So that was something that had very direct, very profound impact for her whole community. She was able to relocate into a beautiful new apartment, keep her Section 8 vouchers, stay in the neighborhood that was close to her school and her daughter's daycare. It was really, it was a really pretty awesome success. So we worked on a follow-up story that highlighted and this is also an important note I'll pause on really quick. It's really useful when you are working on these stories to come back to the story and come back to the storyteller. I think you can always check in with folks after, like, I think actually it's really essential that we always check in with folks after, ask how they feel, ask what they think about the results, or if there aren't results, like where they're at, what next steps they want to take. Always important to check in. That's going back to that authentic relationship. Turquesa wanted to do another story, and so did the reporter. So we worked on a follow-up story that is highlighted right here, and that highlighted the systemic challenges that were undergirding this whole situation and showed Turquesa's new home with her daughter's newly decorated bedroom and no infestation and no loss of her Section 8 voucher. All right, now I think it's really important that we are also thinking about how to be strategic about platforms. It's important for us to think through who are our audiences and where do our audiences get their information. I see a lot of folks prioritize getting, the biggest news organization, prioritizing like the Seattle Times or national news, when their ideal audiences might not actually follow those platforms very closely. For instance, if you're trying to reach a Spanish language communities, you want to work with a storyteller who speaks Spanish and pitch to a platform that is Spanish language. And also good to think about pitching to local papers, community blogs, ask aligned community organizations with reach in your hoped for audiences to reshare your posts. You rarely need to place stories in the highest profile publication, but rather in the publications or the platforms that your audiences are looking to. And so another example that again was before my time at the county. So another disclaimer that the county doesn't do advocacy, we just do education. And this is just an example that hopefully your organization can pull from. So when I was at this grassroots org that was focused on supporting renters, we worked with many local publications because our audiences were often, a lot of the time we were thinking about audiences that were the local people in power, the local electeds, wanting to make sure that we were getting in front of folks who had power to, immediately respond. And so we weren't thinking about how can we get in front of the most people. We were thinking about how can we get in front of the people who will who need to see this most immediately. And so, for instance, this was a wonderful story that we worked on for renters in a mobile home park in Auburn who largely spoke Spanish. It made sense for us to work with Univision. Our audience and our messengers were Spanish speaking. And so we wanted to make sure we were connecting them with reporters who they felt really comfortable and at ease speaking with. In addition, they were also wanting the audience they were most wanting to reach was actually their neighbors. The first story included just a few renters who were heading to court for a case around basically they were living in a mobile home park and their property owner was refusing to make necessary repairs while still demanding their rent. And there was only a few folks who were engaged with this case. But through a combination of organizing and outreach and this news story, this first news story that came out about these three families. And I also want to pause to note that that combination of work is really essential. It can't just be the news story. It also has to be that one-on-one outreach. It has to be those things. They reinforce each other. So anyway, so after that initial story came out, when the folks went to the court case, they were supported by about 20 other neighbors. So most of the folks from the mobile home park were representing there, and the property owner did not show up. So they were able to advance their efforts and find some success in that. So that was really, really great to work on. Okay. And so similar to being strategic about what platforms you're trying to get your stories on, you also want to talk or you want to tell your stories across multiple unique platforms. We reach more communities when we message on a variety of platforms with storytellers from different backgrounds and experiences. So you want to be getting your media hits and getting them in, local newspapers, in, hyperlocal blogs, in multicultural media. You want to be sharing on your own blog. You want to be sharing on social media and working with partners to reshare your posts. You want to put this on your website, and you want to send it out in newsletters, and also build up original assets as you can with video and flyers. So a good way to go about this is to identify the communities you're trying to reach and work with a storyteller from that community. And so sometimes when I ask folks about the audiences they're trying to reach, they're like, everybody, which is, it's better to think a little bit more specifically, because a lot of the time we're actually not trying to reach everybody. We're trying to reach, folks who are impacted, folks who have influence. And so we want to be specific about, reaching those communities. And so when you're telling stories across multiple unique platforms, just make sure that you're working with storytellers who can reach those specific communities. And then, of course, that means placing the story in a place that's visible to that community, whether it's by landing in their local paper's op-ed or sharing a blog post on Facebook, on a Facebook group for the community. Try not to do the one and done approach, but rather build a narrative strategy on working with multiple storytellers who are messaging to audiences who they have shared experiences with, whether it's language, location, or related experiences. And like an example, if you're working in Federal Way, one of your first stops doesn't need to be the Seattle Times, but rather the Federal Way Mirror. And when you're rolling out social media posts that carry, make sure that they carry a narrative arc. So that means you can tell the story across multiple posts rather than trying to capture the whole story in one post. And I have an example of that too, that is that you get to preview before it even goes live. But we have an awesome project, the Youth Healing Project, that was started in community, and that Best Starts has started funding to keep it going. But the Youth Healing Project is a youth-led project where young folks can apply for mini grants to create mental health supports for their peers. And so we have been promoting the Youth Healing Project in advance of the project starting, but now we get to roll out these really awesome posts on social media that highlight each Youth Healing Project leader. And so this is going to be something that we don't try to tell in one post, but rather tell over the course of a couple weeks. And then we're also going to make sure that we are offering opportunities to the young folks who we work with to share their stories in other ways, like if they want to share their experience working on the project through video, through op-eds. So throughout the year, you can expect to see Youth Healing Project media, because this is something that we want to make sure that we're really dedicating a narrative arc to. Another example of how we do sort of person-led work at the county is around our Mental Health Month posts, where we had young folks work with King County staff to develop blog posts that highlight sort of how they see the mental health challenges that young people are facing from their personal perspective, while offering resources and just some additional knowledge and supports. I have another disclaimer here noting that county workers don't and can't use county time for advocacy, but we do offer information and education about the work that we're doing. And so in the interest of offering the public information about available resources, we're also right now working with families who have been supported by the Best Starts for Kids childcare subsidy to share their stories about how the subsidy has impacted them, to show it's happening at the local level where folks are able to access the subsidy, and also the state and national level when it comes to childcare. Right now, it's really important that we are working with families from different backgrounds who are supported by this Best Start subsidy, because that way we can reach more families who otherwise might not have known the subsidy existed. It's really important that we're working with families with different backgrounds because, other families will be able to see themselves reflected back. So we're working with families who are immigrant families, and we're working with, families who are middle-class families who were not eligible for the subsidy otherwise. Yeah, it's been a really wonderful project to work on. Okay, so pitching and placing stories. And this is something that I think even though this is sort of framed in a way that's really media oriented and news pitch oriented, it's also just a really valuable way for us to think about stories that we're pitching, that we're placing on our own platforms, because the similar principles apply. It's really still valuable to include a hook. It's valuable to make sure that there's a goal in the story, and it's important to think through the relevant materials that support the story overall. So a hook, just for to explain if folks aren't familiar with what a hook is a compelling story element that captures a reader. It's usually at the top of the story, like in the headline or in the first few sentences. It should be relevant to the leadership, and not the leadership, the readership, and make the audience want to read more. So an example of a hook that will be, in one of our childcare stories is, this mother is a childcare worker herself who can't afford to pay for childcare for her kid, but the Best Starts for Kids subsidy helped her cover the costs, and now they're breathing easier. So that's the sort of thing that we're thinking about, is how to capturing some of the most compelling elements of a story in the shortest amount of time. So that's a good way to think of a hook. So always keep that in mind as you're pitching and placing stories. Is what's the hook here? Because reporters are definitely going to be looking for that. And if you're generating your own content on your own sites, that's going to be what captures readers or your audiences. And then think through, what's the goal? What's the purpose of sharing this story? It's important to have a goal, even when it's sort of largely about education. Because if you have a focus on here's what I want to accomplish, I want to make sure that this group of young people in this community knows that this resource is available, so that we can helpfully get more folks using this resource. So that education has a very clear and direct purpose. So make sure that you have a clear goal. And when you're working with storytellers, make sure that your goal is clearly communicated to the storyteller that you're working with. And that it's aligned with the storyteller's goal. So that's really important. Again, just getting back to agency of the storyteller. And then this last piece is particularly valuable when pitching to a reporter, because reporters are in newsrooms that are understaffed, overworked, and under-resourced. And so when you present them with essentially all the pieces of a story that they'll need to report it out, you're able to move that pitch a lot quicker. And so the elements that you'll want to always include if you're pitching to a reporter is include, sources that you have on hand. So this would include your storyteller. And when you're working with reporters, and I can answer any follow-up questions pretty soon because I'm almost done with this section, but when you're working with reporters and pitching, you'll want to be working with storytellers who are eager to share their name and who are eager to be photographed, because reporters generally almost exclusively do not want to work with folks who do not go on the record. Their editors will not be happy about that. So it's important that if you have somebody who doesn't want their name on the record, that you think of different storytelling options for them as a general rule. So again, you'll want to include a connection to a storyteller, somebody who's directly impacted and wants to share their story. You'll also want to include sources who can offer other context. So perhaps staff from your team who might have insights in how a resource is becoming available, or has some technical information to offer. Maybe you want to also think through another partner who's available to speak to the issue and can offer supporting quotes. The other thing that you'll want to have on hand is documentation or reference materials. If you're highlighting a successful diaper drive, that is a unique way to distribute diapers, you could share materials that highlight how effective your diaper distribution is. Just really important to think through, like, what are the actual, like, sort of numbers, data, and also documentation that can, like, offer credibility to the story and that sort of, like, data context, because that is really important to share. Okay. And so now that I've talked a lot and perhaps even lost my voice a little bit, I want to kind of turn this back to folks who are here today. I'll start really quickly. A reminder that this session is being recorded. So if we want to talk about any specific stories of folks, let's just not use any identifying information of individuals. Let's use either fake names or just refer to folks as a storyteller, or whatever comes to mind, just as long as we're not using any identifying information. But then going back to you all, I'm kind of curious to hear about what audiences you're trying to reach. What do you want your audiences to know more about your work? And who are your potential storytellers? And so I think it would be great if we could perhaps start with questions, and then we can go into these prompt questions and explore that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but also I need to make sure that I have these helpful things copied into the chat. So just a second. Oh my gosh. Ugh. Man, I didn't make it easy to copy this. Okay, I'll figure that out in a second. Okay. I gotta just stop sharing. All right. So, initial questions or thoughts or observations. Lori, I don't know if that's a hand up or just a clap, but I appreciate either.
Oh, it's both. I was just raising my hand. So if the person has a domestic violence situation and they want to be kept private,
Mm-hmm.
that's because there's a lot of really valuable stories, but people are, how do you do that without, you have to have a privacy thing. So I'm just wondering, because those are cases where the voices aren't heard, but there's no way to share them, and they're never shared, or things that happen to people that are never shared, that are like medical gaslighting and horrific things where people are treated really badly for their disability or whatever. It's a real common thing, but nobody talks about it ever, and it's so valuable. But how do you do that?
No, you're
and
so right, Lori. Yeah, this is a challenge that I often ran into in my work as a reporter and in community organizations, because people really wanted to share their story and they wanted to destigmatize the experience that they were having, and it was not necessarily safe for them to share their name. I think this is like one of those opportunities where you do just find options where they don't need to use their name. I know that there's changes in how reporters are working on stories when they're talking about folks who have experienced like gendered violence, and I think that's something that makes me a little bit hopeful that we can tell more of these stories without expecting people to use their names in a way that reaches a broader public. But it's always important, like I said, to just prioritize the well-being of the storyteller. And so so I think it's good to share those stories, but perhaps just find ways to not use their name. So I would use just visuals. So like maybe share a quote. And also when we're telling some of these like really painful stories, I think it's also nice to ask folks to share like what they like when we're talking about domestic violence, or when we're talking about folks who are afraid of deportation, or other folks who are in vulnerable situations.
Medical things that are abnormal too.
Exactly.
There's such unknown and really weird stuff.
Yeah. I think it's really good for us to try to like paint a really, holistic human picture. So like I always ask folks when they're sharing these stories and when they're so generous with sharing these short stories that are really painful to kind of tell me a little bit about like what would it mean to feel like, like what would it mean to feel safe, or tell me a little bit about your kid, because we want to also highlight the side of them that's like really experiences joy and peace, because those sort of things then add to the whole human picture. So if we can't use their name for very good reasons, we
Or
want
you
to
could
make sure.
make up a name. Is it okay for them to make a name up, like a
Oh,
different name,
totally.
pending, and
Yes, we
then they
can. Yeah, we would still want to, you'd still want to disclose that it's this name is a, name they're using to protect their identity.
right.
But yes, you can absolutely use a different name.
That might be one avenue that they could use.
Yeah. Um, and so I'm gonna look, and Lori, I'm gonna check on the chat, but
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for
okay,
answering.
great. So I see the question is, do you have any advice for collecting stories from youth? I often find myself getting very short, not very useful responses when asking them about the impact of the programs they attend. That's a great question. And yeah, this is like, there's always like kind of, in working with like different folks, you're gonna have different ranges of like participation. So some of that will come down to personality. And I'm not surprised that, there's younger folks and, teenagers who don't necessarily want to offer a ton of information. One thing that could, so there's like a couple different things. I'd say like, if you're looking for specific stories that highlight young people's experience, just put the request out to a larger group of young people and ask them if they'd like to share their story. So this is, less about just like overarching, like, trying to get stories out of everyone, and just like really seeking like who wants to be a storyteller. That's what we found success with, like, or I found success with when working with young people, is like the young folks who are really eager to share their story. They'll talk more and they'll like work on a story with a lot more intention and excitement than folks who are not necessarily as excited. So seek out the folks who really want to be storytellers. Another approach is like peer-to-peer. So if we have young people making that ask, you're probably also gonna like get a, they'll have more insight in like their, community of young people's interests and how folks communicate. And so they might have more success than an adult or an older adult. That's something that I've noticed being helpful as well, as the peer-to-peer work can be a really good way. All right, so I'm going to plug some of these questions in the chat, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop asking questions or anything. Just some things that I think might be helpful for you to think through and talk through. So, and another thing I want to note is that like, for Best Starts, like we really think that a successful like approach to communication for our work is that we are really sharing, that we're really partnering with you. So if you're finding success in your storytelling strategies, that's like something that we consider like success for all of us. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask if you have any supports or questions about some of the goals that you have. And I'm going to go on mute and let it be quiet for a little bit in case people want to ask questions or respond to the questions I put in the chat. All right, what audiences are you trying to reach? Hey, Will, I see your hands up.
Hi, I wasn't sure if there was a queue going on or something. I don't want to jump in if somebody else has something to say. I just started, I'm so totally amateur, but I just started working with a houseless arts project through the Arcade Playhouse here, well south of you. Um, and I hadn't realized how much I really don't have any idea how to deal with mental health in a healthy way. Like I've seen so many bad ways to deal with it, and to interact with it. And so I'm really excited to be around all these people that really know what they're doing. But it's brought up this question about the audience you're trying to reach, and also how to. I love the thing you shared about how to help people have agency in telling their stories, because a lot of these people really want to tell their stories, and also they might be really triggered about certain things that would never occur to me. Maybe I have judgments about them internally and I need to like set that aside. Um, so I mean, there's it seems to me like I need to do some learning and research before I even make that step of saying, hey, please share your story with me, or I'd love to hear it, or whatever. I wonder if you could talk about that, like preparation as opposed to doing it on the fly.
Yeah, no, great observation. And I think I also worked in the recovery space and know that that was definitely something that it was really important to be conscientious of. And when you see some top-down communication strategies, you can get some communication that seems to be not really respecting the full autonomy and agency of folks who are going through recovery. And so some characteristics of that type of storytelling might be where it's exclusively focused on just like the pain or anguish someone is going through, and not necessarily the whole person and some of like the things that they're looking for when it comes to resources and supports. Um, and so I think the way that I have gone about like this work, especially when I'm working with storytellers who have been, kind of through the ringer, like, like experiencing homelessness, or navigating recovery in a system that doesn't necessarily support like, recovery. So like, so when I'm working with folks who have been through that, it's really just about kind of like offering as much information I can, and also just like making it really clear I want them to be in charge of their story. And saying like, hey, this is what we're thinking of for this video. We want to use this video to sort of like highlight the resource that's going to be available for folks. How do you feel about that? What are your thoughts about that? And also just like make sure that as I'm, editing the video or whatever, that they get to have like, they get to see the progress, they get to see what's included or excluded. And then on, the end, on my end, when I'm actually putting the story together, I really want to make sure that the story that I'm, pulling together is not necessarily just highlighting the pain and anguish, but the whole person. What is their goal? Like, what are their hopes? What makes them them? And so when we focus on, the human, like side of the story, we actually tell a better story. And it also ends up having like better results too, because it's way more focused, and it's something that like we're working on as a team. I don't know. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. All right, I'm gonna go back to the chat. I'm not very good at multitasking, folks, so sorry about that. All right. Okay, so a question in the chat. Kindring serves young children with developmental delays and disabilities, so our main audience is parents of kids with disabilities and donors. We try to include a wide range of disabilities and families of diverse backgrounds, and I think that's great. Yeah, and especially tell stories that destigmatize disability. I think that's really smart. And yeah, and it's like clear that you have a focus on like who your audience is, and also that you're trying to not just necessarily, paint a broad brush, but like really make sure that you're focusing on families who represent a spectrum of experiences. Hi, Cindy.
Hey, Erin, thank you so much for this session. So it's a great refresher and I've learned so much. I do have a question about storytelling. I sometimes wonder if to like, for example, what if I'm telling a story or if you're at an event and listening to a story and you just, I don't know how to link it to like, so here's the purpose, right? Like rather than just listening to a story about an immigrant or a refugee or their struggles, and then you're like, oh well, or like, okay, what will I do with that? I just don't know whether at the end of the day my audience or my donor or my funder is actually like, yeah, okay, I know what to do, or I'm impacted, or if the story resonated, rather than just it being another story that they've heard, you know, for the fifth time, but in a different way. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. And this is absolutely kind of always something to be thinking of in your storytelling process. I think I've run into this challenge myself as well. And I think if you kind of like, you want to start, again, you want to start with a storyteller, so you're focused on them. And part of that conversation that you have with them is asking them, what is it that you hope this accomplishes? And you also keep in mind like sort of your organization's goals and some of the things that you're working on. And you kind of, reflect and see if those things are connected. And when you come to like, when there's certain, some of the examples that I gave had like really clear connection to like story and purpose, right? Because somebody was like, we had folks who were just trying to get repairs or they were trying to get relocation assistance. Sometimes we're working with folks who've had like a multitude of experiences that really impact and shape who they are. And it shapes also just like what they want in that moment, which can be just a lot of change. So sometimes these are folks who we actually can work with like over the course of a long period of time. They probably have a lot of different experiences that can connect back to a lot of different purposes. So we don't have to just work with a person one time, but we can work with a person as many times as they're wanting to. And so in that instance, it might even be something that you can consider like a good problem, or I don't know, I don't want to like minimize or frame, but it's like a situation where a person like, they might actually be eager to share their story, attaching it to a lot of different purposes. Somebody saying like, yeah, I'm talking instead about like, hey, this is this, program that provides immigrant relief during the pandemic. And this is important to me because as an immigrant, I can relate to this experience. Or, similarly, like this Best Starts for Kids childcare subsidy is really important to me because as an immigrant, like it's been challenging for me to access some of the subsidies that are available to other folks. So it's like you can work with somebody who has a lot of passion and is eager to share their story and just kind of find those opportunities alongside them to kind of like connect that story to a specific purpose. And I know the examples I just gave were kind of more advocacy oriented. But there's things that like you can do in the same sort of just like providing information about resources. So yeah. Does that help, Cindy?
Yeah. It really does. Thank you so much. It helps to know that I'm not the only one that thinks about that too. So
totally. Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah. And another thing is that I also usually tend to think about that. It's like one of the things to think of right away is like, okay, what's the purpose of this story going to be? So you're not just, you get to think about those things at the same time so that you can really focus in. But again, treating it as a partnership, that means that like, oh, this gets to be a long-term thing that we work on as long as this person is eager to work on it.
No, that's a great point. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. All right. So what do you want your audiences to know more about your work? This is kind of getting back to that purpose piece that we were just talking about. It's also okay if we don't have any. Oh, yeah, Lori.
So I have another question. So for this grant, this is part of the early childhood grant. So the stories would need to be from parents or participants of the grant in the early childhood areas. These would be family children mostly, or single moms maybe. Is that?
Oh, and Lori, you might be referring to a grant that I'm not familiar with. So this session is mostly just about kind of like providing like communications ideas and supports. I don't have a grant attached to this.
Sure.
But if you're working on a grant and trying to find stories for it. Yeah.
Oh, so this one isn't part of the grant, like isn't there funding that people get to do these, or how does that work?
Not for this particular session. We did have a communications grant or funding opportunity last year, but this particular session is not connected to a funding opportunity. Sorry for any confusion there.
So the people didn't get any funding for it or anything, just
no. So not for this particular, not related to this particular session. I do want Best Starts to be a resource support for folks here. So like, as you're like thinking through, like one of the challenges that I knew I ran into when I was working in organizations was just like resources to sort of like support on stories. And some of those resources was simply time. Some of it was about like equipment. Some of it was about, like relationships to reporters. And so I do want to make sure that I make it clear that I'm a resource to like help with any sort of like guidance. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to email me. And also just a reminder, and I know I feel like I've done so many disclaimers, but since we're government, anything that you send us an email is definitely available to public records requests. So just make sure that if you have anybody that you're talking about whose identity is vulnerable, just, be conscientious that you can request public records.
So there's not a grant attached to this, like financial, like if the agency that I'm here just as an advocate, I'm not the head of it. They would need to apply for a grant through something else to get funding, and they could still do this project with other funding from another source, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean,
So like if they had a heritage grant, they could use this platform here with something for a heritage where they might get actual funding.
And so if the organization you're representing wants to do some more communications strategy and they want that funded, yes, they could probably find a funding resource to support
Okay,
that.
but they don't get funding through this particular one, but it's a valuable platform for them.
Yes.
So there's not a due date for this one on
Nope, this is just a workshop session to offer some info.
I see. Okay, I got it. I wanted to make sure that was clear because I wasn't sure about that, but it's info on how to do that so they could use it for other resources. Okay, that's awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. So we just have a couple minutes. I want to make sure that I have space for any additional questions or comments. All right. Well, folks, I've really appreciated you joining me here today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'm going to put my email in the chat one more time. I know it's further up in the chat, but I also don't like scrolling up through Zoom, so I'll just put it right here. If you have any questions, if you have any ideas that you want to talk through, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I really enjoy this work, so love to chat about it even more. Thanks, folks.